there are a couple of really interesting things around the gathering of data. Obviously, if we are interacting more educationally online, of course that has the benefit of enabling us to retain information, to collect data on those interactions, how students are, how they're progressing, and then for teachers, schools, systems to be able to analyse that. And that covers a wide range of potential values that come out of that. One would be in the arena of, for example, student well-being, how people are getting on, how they're actually managing their work, how they're going about doing their work. What is the home context that they're living in? Are they actually trying to work in a room with 5 other kids there, or have they got a luxurious attic to work out of? All these sorts of things. We are going to be in a situation where teachers, if they want it, can access a very wide range of cross-complementary data about that. That leads on, I think, very interestingly into the question of the impact of the pandemic on the way that systems are going to start to think about assessment. I'm talking here particularly about schools, but actually, to be frank, it's across the spectrum. It applies to universities too. In the case of schools, overwhelmingly around the world, people are still operating on the basis that high stakes assessment happens on paper, and of course after that there's a great deal of digital intervention, scanning and so on and so forth, on screen marking. But although there are experiments going on in many parts of the world deploying digital assessment at a system level, there are actually none that are doing, if you like, hardcore, high stakes end of course assessments. That they tend to be slightly different kinds of assessment. So nevertheless, obviously, we've all been looking at the potential for digital on-screen capture of assessment at a systemic level for high-stakes assessment. The reason that's important is because actually the way systems behave often cascades downwards from the end of assessment, from the end of course assessment approach, and that applies wherever you are in the world. And so I think that what people have realised is that for the system to be resilient, in other words, for us not to have to, for example, cancel exams or postpone them or diminish them, it would be helpful to start to get to a point where we could do much more in terms of digital capture, both during courses and also actually for hardcore exams. So I would predict a steep acceleration in the interest of ministries of education, of schools groups, in the question of how they can get much more proficient at being able to capture on screen. Exam boards are certainly going to look at that much more seriously. And I would envisage, whereas one might have said, look, it could take 10 to 15 years for these things to move forward because of there's no particular impetus behind it. Suddenly, we have a huge impetus behind it, which is we want our systems to be resilient to this kind of disruption in the future. So I would predict that those timescales are going to come down to 2 or 3 years, and we're going to see a lot of jurisdictions starting to think very seriously about moving towards on-screen capture of high-stakes assessment. And that will then have a very important impact. That will then cascade down through those school systems, because if you know your students are going to do their final examinations or at least partly maybe in an online environment, then you're going to start to adapt your teaching and the way you approach things, and that will impact the entire system. There is a second point, and it's a very interesting point, which, in my view, which is that education systems tend to view this as being a technology question, but it's not primarily a technology question. Overwhelmingly, the the technology largely exists to do these things, and it has been moving on apace over the last 20 years. The real issues actually surround when let's say, for example, we moved to much more high stakes assessment happening online. What does that mean for the way we go about assessing? Does it change the form of the question? Does it change the way in which people enter? Because we can't rely entirely on multiple choice. We can't rely entirely on, picking bits of essays. There are all sorts of questions about how does it change the way we go about assessing things. Those are educational questions, deep educational questions. And although, of course, lots of people have been thinking very seriously about those things over the last 20 years in particular, there's still a long way to go in terms of understanding that. And there is very little understanding of that at a political system and delivery level. So again, I see the potential, indeed I think frankly it's inevitable, that there will be an acceleration of and a much greater intensity of interest. And I think the key thing I would always want to get across about this, and I tend to repeat ad nauseam, is please stop thinking about this as a technology question. It's an education question. The technologists the engineers will deliver what we ask them to deliver, but let's think about it through an educational lens.